Well guys, here's an update of what I've found. Cam sensor did not fix the problem. I think I got it out of time or something. I don't understand how. Here's a diagram of exactly how I did it. Okay, the crankshaft, what you do is you roll the crankshaft around to TDC. See, it's like a Cummins. There's a TDC mark, there's a 1 to 6 mark, there's a 2 to 5 mark, and there's a 3 to 4 mark. So I rolled it around to TDC, which put this mark right up here. There's a mark on the block that these two teeth on the crankshaft gear line up with. And it was just like that. And this gear was to the left 90 degrees of that. And it lined up with the mark on the idler. And these two marks here were just like this, right here. And this gear here is doweled. They're not showing the tone wheel, but the tone wheel is doweled too. So I don't understand, but I'll tell you why I'm thinking this. Something's goofy here. I verified they got me the right cam, but what's going on? I rolled it around. I rolled it around to the TDC mark, and on TDC, number 1 was loose, and number 6, the valves were closed on it. Or no, yeah, the valves were closed on number 1, and number 6 they were in overlap, which is what it's supposed to be. But, okay, guys, I don't remember where I left off, but basically it's in time. Okay. That's all in time. There's nothing wrong with that. Let me tell you what happened here, okay? So we got the camshaft speed sensor, stuck it in there, didn't make any difference. You guys remember the uneven crank I had? So I was been curious about this. So, and it's something I don't know if I discussed when I first started doing that video yesterday, but it started. The first time I went with this thing, it started. And then it just died, like you shut the key off. And then it had that uneven crank. So what I did today is I went in there and I unplugged the cam and the crank sensor. And then I started cranking on it. And the crank was smooth as can be. And that right there, I said, that son of a bitch is shooting the fuel in at the wrong time. And then I started second guessing myself that I had it out of time. But then the more and more I thought about it, there was no way you got it out of time. You would have felt that. You would have known, running your valve train, that you were out of time. That's an interference engine. You would have had bent valves. You would have had, especially if it had been that far out. So I pulled the valve cover off. I ran it to TDC mark. And on the TDC mark, number 1 valves were loose. Number 6 were tight. And then I went through the whole overhead, and everything was right where it's supposed to be. So it's not out of time. Something's going on with that damn ECM, and it's shooting the fuel in at the wrong time. Because if you can, so what I did too is I went back and I plugged in the cam sensor and left the crank sensor unplugged, and it had the uneven crank. And then I unplugged them both, and then it cranked smooth. And then I went and plugged the crank sensor in and left the cam sensor unplugged, and then I had the uneven crank. So something in that ECM took a shit. I'm going to call Kevin, my buddy there. It's got the blue and white Peterbilt. He has an EPA 13. And I'm going to ask him if I can borrow his ECM. And we're going to stick it in there tomorrow and see if it'll fire up. It'll only idle because they're VIN locked to the body control module on these Peterbilts. But that's all I need. I just need it to fire. So that's where we're at, guys. It's kind of looking like a bad ECM is what it looks like. So anyhow, I'll keep you posted. We're gonna pull this ECM. Well, we're gonna put this ECM in this truck, and if it doesn't start, then we know it's this ECM off the Paccar. But I gotta change his airbag real quick. He blew an airbag. What's up, Duke? There's another squeeze that I got to do a retrofit on that I haven't had time to do yet. We got to get on that. I haven't been paid for the last one. Guy still owes me like 12,000 bucks, so I haven't been paid for that one. Why is this? This thing got aluminum. Hang on. Alright guys, so you're going to find out later in this video that I put the ECM in there and this one started right up. Okay, so I did some testing while I was here. I wanted to see what it would do, and this thing, I unplugged the cam sensor and it started off the crankshaft speed sensor. And then I plugged the crankshaft speed sensor in and it started off the camshaft speed sensor. So, what I'm getting at, that kind of rules out a couple things. I was thinking just different scenarios going through my mind. You know, the tone wheel is dialed to the camshaft and the flywheel is dialed to the crankshaft. And I thought, man, did I get it off or something on the tone wheel? Well, if it'll start off the crankshaft speed sensor and vice versa off the cam, that kind of rules those out. I mean, I can't imagine both of them being off. And I'm pretty certain they're right anyway. I do remember getting the flywheel off a little bit, and I started tightening it down, and then I realized it wasn't bolting down square, and I unbolted it and realized that I was off a bolt hole. So I rotated it counterclockwise, and it popped right on, and then I tightened it up. And then I remember looking through the hole and seeing the dowel hole. So I know the flywheel is right. So anyways, what I'm saying is, if it'll start off one or the other, you know that kind of rules that out. Because I've tried starting that engine down there, you know, just off the crankshaft speed sensor, and it still did that uneven crank. And what I don't understand, guys, about this uneven crank is if you were out of time with the cam to crank timing, it sure seems to me, with all the overheads and valve trains that I've done in my life, that you would feel that while you were adjusting your valves. You would get to a spot where something, you know, you guys have done it a million times. You'll get to an adjuster and you'll go, how come I've got more threads sticking out on that one than I do on that one and on that intake valve? What the hell's going on here? Or you could be turning the engine over by hand and come up to a hard spot because the damn valve's hitting the piston. You know, so I didn't have any of those issues. You know, some other guys were asking me how fast it was spinning over, and I was watching that on the live data, and I was only getting about 160 RPM. And another thing I noticed, I kept getting, even with the battery jumpers, I had my battery charger at 40 amps on those batteries while I was cranking because they were weak when I first went to start that thing. They wouldn't even hardly turn that thing over. And so I had put the battery charger on it and let it charge. Well, I keep getting this low voltage disconnect on the dash display. And I'm only getting about maybe 160, 170 RPM. That's if it's actually spinning really good. And I just noticed on Kevin's truck out here that his didn't really even start until it got to about 200 RPM on the cranking on it. So, I mean, is it possible that the starter and batteries are bad in it and it's dragging the ECM down to where it's not working right? You know, that's what I'm kind of wondering. So I kind of got a plan tomorrow morning. I've got like 3 good Group 31 batteries that I know that are really good. I'm going to go pull those batteries out of there, stick those in there, and I'm going to be one mad son of a bitch if that thing starts up with those batteries in there. Or do I put my inductive ammeter on that starter and see how many amps I've got an inductive ammeter, but I think it only goes to 600 amps, so I don't know if that would do it or not. But anyway, you know, guys, I went over to the TDC mark and I checked it on the flywheel and on the crank damper on the front, and I put it on TDC, and on TDC, number 1 valves were loose and number 6 were tight. I think right there that should verify that you're in time. So, but it still doesn't make any sense, the uneven crank. And then you can unplug those cam and crank sensors, and then the crank is nice and smooth like it's supposed to be. But you plug either one in, and then you got that uneven crank. To me, that tells me that maybe a possibility of a couple different things, that either the ECM's commanding the fuel, because I got on the live data and it says injected fuel quantity and it says 1.85 grams per cycle. So you know that the ECM is commanding it to shoot fuel in, but it acts like it's shooting it in at the wrong time. So the other possibility is, I was thinking about the voltage issue with the starter dragon, because I had a 7.3 Power Stroke one time that would not start, and the batteries were so bad you could put jumpers on it, and you could, and the starter was bad too in that. We ended up changing the battery and the starters, and the batteries and the starter. And what was doing, it would pull the voltage down to like 9 volts, but it still spun over pretty good. But the starter was pulling enough amperage that it would not let the injector drivers would not cycle and inject the fuel. So I'm really wondering if there's something like that, or it almost acts like the way it's got that uneven crank, like it's either shooting the fuel in at the wrong time, or it's got like one injector driver or something or two that's working and it's shooting the fuel in and it's lazy. I don't know. There's a million things going through my mind as to what it could possibly be. But, man, at this point, I've read a lot of you guys' comments, and I've actually went and tried a couple of those things that people were talking about. Some guy was talking about some nipple in the primary fuel filter that was broke off. There's no nipple on the primary fuel filter. I don't know what he's talking about, but that's not the problem. And anyway, that didn't make any difference. I've sucked right out of a 5-gallon bucket and bypassed the primary fuel filter anyway. All right, so I got interrupted there. So anyway, the secondary fuel filter on the engine block, there's discussion about this check ball. Okay, and I pulled that check ball out of there, like they say. They leave the little green part in there that goes in there and pull the check ball out. Didn't make any difference. So I've sucked directly out of a bucket. And another thing that I've done, everybody, did you torque the feed tubes? Yes, those were all torqued. I mean, they're not torqued now. I've just tightened them by hand because I've had them loose, messing around with this thing forever. But initially, they were torqued to spec. I put a crow's foot on them and a torque wrench and torqued them to spec with the torque turn and all that bullshit. So that's not it. And what I don't understand is that the rail pressure is 4,700 psi, and the desired is like 3,600, and which should not make any difference whatsoever on the. I've had I shouldn't say millions. I've had hundreds of common rail issues and problems and fuel systems torn apart, and I've never seen a deviation between actual and desired rail pressure make an uneven crank like that. So I don't know. I'm almost down to almost pulling the transmission and pulling that rear structure off and verifying the timing on it, but I almost know that I think I'm wasting my time because I know it's in time. I don't know. I don't really know what to do at this point, guys, but I know that the ECM is not the problem. The cam and crank sensors are not the problem. I know I have power and ground to the ECM. I'm communicating with the ECM. I'm not really sure where to go from here. I'm going to try the slow cranking and see if that takes me anywhere. So what we'll do tomorrow morning, I've got 3 good Group 31 batteries. We'll stick those in there, and we'll see if we can we'll watch the live data on the laptop to see what RPMs, and watch the tach and see if the RPMs come up. I noticed it on this truck right here that it didn't really want to start till it got to around 200 RPM. I might look in the service manual tonight and see if there's a cranking speed that it has to have, but it still doesn't explain, even if the cranking speeds are slow, what's the deal with the uneven crank. That's the whole problem with all of this. So anyways, I'll let you know more on this never-ending drama with this Paccar piece of shit.